Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree isn't just another expansion. The general player base sees it as one of the best DLC in the history of gaming. It's a brutal, mind-bending journey into the heart of madness. From twisted new bosses and areas that will leave you questioning your sanity to the latest weapon that practically rewrite the game's meta, this DLC doesn't pull any punches. But does the DLC live up to the hype? Is the DLC's $40 price tag worth it? How much time you can get out of this expansion? Whether you are a newcomer or a Souls-like veteran, this video is for you, as these are the questions that we'll be answering in this 100% review. So ultimately, you can decide if you want to jump into the DLC or pass on it. Let's dive into the heart what makes Shadow of the Erdtree DLC so captivating, its story and setting. Going back to the roots of the base game, the main story of Elden Ring happened in the lands between, where the most of the key characters or personas were introduced to us. And yet, after managing to piece through every event in the base game, there were still underlying mysteries that have yet to be deciphered. And the said mysteries will be unraveled in the DLC, making the whole narrative rather complete to a certain extent. In Shadow of the Erdtree, the story takes place in the land of Shadow, where the Tarnished will follow the footsteps of Michaela, who is going to be one of the main driving personas of the DLC. You as a Tarnished will track down Michaela along with his followers in this perilous land filled with nothing but mysteries. Environmental storytelling here is your usual FromSoft top-notch approach. Each area you explore tells its own tale, and you can almost feel the history seeping through the cracks in the walls or the eerie silence in a forgotten village. As expected, FromSoft traditional storytelling has been preserved in the DLC, where item descriptions play a big role in explaining events or giving context to certain things. NPCs are your go-to for deciphering the story, especially if you stick with their side quests. However, be warned, Souls-like veterans know that it's all too easy to miss or get locked out from these quests, especially if you are a beginner. The story might be a hit or miss for some, and particularly if you are new to the series. But if you have been around the block, you are in for a treat. As you progress through major areas and reach the end, the story slowly unfolds, with NPCs helping you piece together what's going on. But as mentioned, you can easily miss all of the important NPC quests, especially in your first playthrough, that may shed light on the story, so either you are going to have a blast when reaching the end, or complete the DLC without having a clue what the story is about, which is a normal thing, especially if you are a newcomer in the Soulsborne genre. After piecing out the lore bits and pieces from items, characters, and events that happen in the Land of Shadow, I finally understood the whole picture. I was blown away after knowing the real intentions of key characters in the game, and instantly got addicted into the DLC's lore, wanting to dig deeper as there were still a lot of things that needed to be uncovered. It took me 3 playthroughs to check out every NPC quest and get all the items in the game, hoping for more information and lore beats from them. Deep inside me, I still wanted more, and this hunger is here to stay, and it will last for quite a while. By looking at the story as a whole, I cannot stress how intriguing and fascinating it is. The bizarre storytelling of From Software was again executed phenomenally, and because of this, story and setting will have a 9.8 score in my book. Story and setting is out of the way, moving on to the overall presentation of the game. From a visual standpoint, Shadow of the Erdtree DLC does not disappoint, and it is mind-blowing in a lot of ways. As soon as the player enters the Land of Shadow, they can already see the passion and immense effort on level design. My eyes melted while trying to check what's out there right away. The whole area of the DLC is a maze itself, and it is not your ordinary map, but more into this later. Each area is distinct with a unique ambience that draws you in, all enhanced by ambient OSTs that perfectly match the setting. From the vast golden open fields and maze castles to lush forests and barren ruins and villages, every area has its identity. Because of the distinct level design, it helped me remember all the important locations should I need to backtrack to complete NPC quests or even get more loot. While the graphic fidelity is outdated and might not have seen major overhauls, the art directions remains the game's stronger suit. However, I spent 4,000 hours playing in the base game, and I've noticed that the Land of Shadow has this polished feel when talking about graphic fidelity. Maybe it's just me, but I am seeing far more better textures and lighting in the Land of Shadow. What I also noticed as well is how eye candy are the new animations of the latest sorceries and incantations. Elden Ring DLC is the last installment as far as Miyazaki-san claims, so I felt that they put in all the efforts as the new Ashes of War and spells were so fun and engaging to use. And as mentioned, I cannot help but to love all of their animations from a visual standpoint. But the icing on the cake, and one of the greatest feats of Elden Ring, and also the thing that took my experience to the whole new level, is the characters' top-notch voice acting. We've been introduced to new characters in the DLC, and every one of them has their distinctive identity thanks to their appearance and mesmerizing voices, adding layers of depth to each character. I always find myself wanting to know more about them, which speaks volumes about the quality of the narrative. With that being said, overall presentation will get a solid 9.5 score in this review. The core gameplay is always been the strongest feat of the Soulsborne games. Starting strong, the opening area of the DLC is nothing short of awe-inspiring. As mentioned previously, as soon as I set foot in the first DLC area, I can help but jump into exploration with Torrent. Exploration is addictive as ever, keeping you wondering what's hidden treasures or new items you might stumble upon. We've already talked about how jaw-dropping the overall level design is, and thanks to it, exploration was always been a visual treat in my case. I find myself frequently pausing briefly just to admire what's in front of me. When it comes to level progression, let's start with the DLC's overall size. According to Miyazaki-san in recent interviews about how big the DLC will be, the DLC is supposed to be big as Limgrave, but honestly, it feels like Limgrave plus Caelid with a chunk of Lunar Lakes. And yes, it's that massive, and players who play the base game can relate to this. Level progression and design are the two major feats of the DLC. The areas can feel overwhelming at first visually, and if you take a look closely at your map, it tricks you on being straightforward. But I can assure you it's not. There are going to be a lot of visible areas right in front of you where you can't easily go right away. These areas are mostly can be accessed through a multi-layered hidden passage, which made me insane during my first playthrough. But with intricate layouts that make exploration a joy, especially the DLC's legacy dungeons, and I cannot stress how good the layout of these dungeons, and I felt that it was a step up compared to the base game's legacy dungeons. These are not the typical areas that you can easily map out, as they are full of secret paths leading to new locations or even lead to different levels of that certain areas. As mentioned, the map itself is deceptive with overlaying areas that are creatively interconnected. And of course, when exploring new areas, players will most of the time be rewarded for their curiosity with the newly added items and equipment in the DLC. The new items you find are rewarding, and each with unique effects and designs that make discovering the next one a thrill. Miyazaki promised a huge DLC, and he delivered beyond expectations. However, even though the overall exploration and level design is a stellar feat of the DLC, there were a lot of areas that were a bit empty, lacking enemies or rewards. It's a minor gripe, but it's noticeable when you're used to finding something around every corner in the base game. Others will say that the whole empty areas are made for environmental storytelling, but I tend to disagree on this one, as we can have good environmental storytelling while not making the player feel the vast emptiness of a certain area. While these areas are jaw-droppingly beautiful as mentioned, I can help but to feel this emptiness frequently, especially when exploring the overworld. When it comes to combat in Shadow of the Erdtree, there's nothing much to say as no new mechanic has been introduced. Instead, From Software capitalized on its already brilliant combat and made it even better, especially when dealing with the new bosses in the DLC. What I want to focus on is the DLC's controversial difficulty. The DLC sure ramps up the difficulty, especially if you're not blessed with the Erdtree blessing. To understand this mechanic easily, Erdtree blessing increases the player's raw damage and damage negation percentage in the Land of Shadow, a blessing that only applies in the DLC area. Players can then increase their Erdtree blessing by collecting Erdtree fragments scattered across the Land of Shadow. This mechanic has been introduced to balance the overall difficulty of the DLC and to somehow preserve the player's experience. From Software made sure that players will not be able to steamroll the content and it is a brilliant way to do it in my opinion. Hunting and collecting Tree fragments on the other hand adds another addictive layer to the game as players turn these fragments into any side of grace and level up their blessing, and it provided me with an immense sense of progression which is often rewarding. While for enemies and bosses, you will face a mix of new and familiar enemies, each with its own quirks and weaknesses to discover. While many enemies return from the base game, which is a bummer most of the time to be honest, but there will be a decent amount of new enemies to keep the combat fresh and challenging. It is without a doubt that boss fights remain the core of the Elden Ring experience, and the DLC doesn't disappoint. As expected, each bosses were intricately designed with outstanding physics and animation for an overall organic experience. What I love about From Software bosses is they always makes me feel that I am fighting a real and living entity thanks to their top-of-the-line motion captures. Each DLC boss was unique and had their own identity, loaded with freshly new mechanics and attack patterns and well-designed telegraphs movesets. Although the majority of the bosses in the DLC were completely fleshed out, I did have some issues with the last two major bosses. This is a minor gripe and a little bit of a hot take from my end, as the last two bosses feel a bit less grounded. Especially the final boss, it gave me the impression that it lacked polish. It felt way less grounded compared to the other bosses. I know for a fact because I spent like thousands of hours mastering these bosses, so I know what I'm talking about, and I'm not saying the entire fight is bad. In fact, I enjoyed it. But at least in my opinion, the final boss is surely challenging and fun to beat, and it's fair in many cases but lacks at least 20% more polish as a whole in my opinion. However, since From Software released a dedicated patch polishing the final boss's moves, I felt relieved and validated at the same time, since I proved that there was really something wrong with the final boss in terms of polish. Today, anyone will have more fair and polished final fight compared to what we encountered during the release, and this is something to celebrate. And with that out of the way, moving on to the overall difficulty of the game. As many players stated that the DLC was simply too hard, however my take is the other way around, which is the DLC being fair 90% of the time. My first playthrough was completed without the Erdtree blessing adjustments, and yet I find it all fair. In my opinion, the adjustment for the Erdtree blessing is not that needed, and the game's raw form is fine during launch. Every death that I suffered was fair, and I know that it was caused by my own mistakes, and no mechanic that I find in the game imbalanced. Now diving into the performance review, I'm well aware that there are many players who encounter prevalent performance issues like stutters and strong FPS dips, and in my case there were no significant stutters were experienced, but I did experience frame drops when fighting bosses, even when playing on a high-end system, and this happens usually when they perform a wide AoE attack. And aside from that, I have not encountered any game-breaking bugs that may possibly halt my progress during all of my playthroughs. Because of this, the overall gameplay will receive another solid 9.8 score. Moving on to the Shadow of the Erdtree's overall replayability. If you love experimenting with different builds, this DLC will keep you hooked. There are nearly endless options for creating builds. Shadow of the Erdtree added more 100 weapons to experience with, along with new weapon types to choose from to keep the experience fresh. The immense replayability that this game has is simply out of this world. As a build creator, I have created a lot of character builds already, but I have barely scratched the surface, and I'm showing them on the screen right now, and it is that good. Also, for a completionist like myself, you need at least 3 playthroughs to get everything, which can easily add up to 40 to 60 hours. My first playthrough took me around 24 hours, but to see everything the DLC offers, multiple runs are necessary. The sheer number of new items, weapons, armors, and talismans to explore is staggering. Each item is relevant and new Ashes of War and Spirits are available, making this DLC a treasure trove for both beginners and veterans alike. And as mentioned, if you are a lore junkie, simply exploring the world again, completing intricate NPC questline can easily net you more playthroughs. If you are the type who enjoys diving deep into PvE or PvP, expect to sink hundreds of hours into this content. And with no exaggeration, I have already spent a total of more than 4,000 hours in this game, and I am still counting. With all that being said, with a 40 USD price tag, the amount of content you are getting here is an absolute steal. deal. Considering all the things that we just talked about, the overall replayability will receive a whopping solid score of 10 in our book. All things considered, it's time for the verdict. Shadow of the Erdtree is simply one of the best or the best DLC in the history of gaming. Its exceptional experience will surely be remembered by many. This is the type of game that stays within you like how the previous Soulsborne titles did. I see it as one of the most cutting-edge titles in my career. However, it is not for everyone. Despite the disputable difficulty, if you are a newcomer in the Souls-like genre, I will still encourage you to try as there are myriads of ways to conquer this game. There were a lot of newcomers who discovered their newfound love for the genre after playing Elden Ring, and you might be one of them soon. On the other hand, if you are a returning Elden Ring player or a Souls-like veteran, it is a no-brainer to get the DLC and have fun with this awesome material. All the things that we've talked about and considered, Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree is a solid 9.8 and will receive the title of a must-play from JRPG Samurai. Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree is a DLC that delivers on almost every front. From its intricate story and setting to its expansive level design and challenging combat, it's clear that this DLC was crafted with the same care and attention to detail that made Elden Ring a masterpiece. Whether you are a newcomer or a seasoned tarnished, there's something here for everyone, and the whole adventure is one you won't soon forget.